students, it's Instructor Shane. This is where we're going to talk about the fundamentals of marksmanship in your online portion. So there's 5 fundamentals to marksmanship. The first fundamental is going to be aiming. That's going to be the relationship between the front and rear sight. So on our firearm, we'll ensure it's clear. Right here we have the front sight, back here we have the rear sight. So when we talk about sight alignment, it's going to be the alignment between the front and rear sight. So if we go to our little whiteboard here, and we have our front sight, there, and then we're going to have our rear sight. What we are looking to achieve when we talk about sight alignment is that our sights have equal height and equal light on each side. Now we have what's called sight picture. That's going to be us putting our sights on the actual target. So right here, this is going to represent maybe the lines of a bullseye target. So you notice how we are having that perfect sight alignment, and that sight picture, we're going to put it in the center of that bullseye target. Now, there's 3 ways that we can end up shooting our gun. We can accomplish this by shooting quickly, carefully, and precisely. Now, some factors to think about when you choose which cadence you use when you're shooting. Remember, we can only shoot as quickly as we can get accurate hits on target. So when I talk about quickly, I want you to think of your rear sight like a window, right? We want to look through that rear sight like a window, and when we see the bumpy thingy, the front sight, then we can go ahead and employ our gun. Now, things to consider in picking your cadence of can I shoot quickly, carefully, and precisely. One of those factors might be distance. I think all our students can agree that everyone is a sniper at 3 yards away from a target. So typically, when we're at those closer distances, we can end up shooting quicker, right? Now, if you need to take a high thoracic cavity shot at, say, 25 to 50 yards, that might be a more precise shot. The big thing to remember is, 1, you never want to trade accuracy for speed. You'll end up paying with your life. The other portion of that is what we call is target chosen, target presented, right? So target chosen, target presented. So if I was the bad guy right now, could you choose where you shot me, right? And I ask, where would you want to shoot me, right? And I get answered a lot of center mass. The correct answer is going to be high thoracic cavity. Right above the heart, where that aorta is going to cause the most effective trauma to that bad guy. Now, when we talk about target presented, right? If I was a bad guy, say, sitting behind a wall, and all you could see was my head coming across that wall, then you don't really have a choice in the matter. It really ends up being target presented, right? You can only effectively hit what is being presented to you. Now, our next fundamental we're going to talk about is hold control. That's how we are going to stand and how we are going to grip the gun. So typically I have students stand towards the target and ask them, how would you stand if you were going to punch them or punch the target, right? So usually feet shoulder width apart, and then we're going to take our dominant leg and just kick it back enough so that I feel stable in a good fighting stance. Next, the way we are going to grip a gun. The way we are going to grip a gun. This is what we call the back strap. I'm going to come high and firm into that back strap, build that good grip with my fingers, and hitchhike this thumb up like I'm asking for a ride. Next, I'm going to take my support hand, fingers extended in joint, just like a G.I. Joe Kung Fu action figure. I'm going to go ahead and karate chop that trigger guard, and then you'll notice all that open real estate on the pistol grip. I'm just going to roll my palm over to ensure I have that full firing grip. Now, a big thing is how tight do we want to grip a gun, right? And I've heard some people talk about a firm handshake. Some people are, you want to death grip it. My thing is we only want to grip in the context in which we are shooting. So typically, if I'm shooting very slow, very fundamentals of marksmanship, I have a firm but yet kind of loose grip, right? Now, when I get into like more of a quickly shooting cadence, now I need to manage that grip a little more to help reduce my recoil. Now, the parts in our hand where we're actually gonna put pressure on the gun. So think of the trigger guard here. Everything south of that trigger is where we're gonna end up gripping the gun. Everything north of this trigger is gonna be nice and relaxed. So when I get into my full firing grip, my thumbs are nice and relaxed up here, where everything south of the trigger guard is reinforced in a nice tight fashion. Now, other things to think about when building your grip. We have what's called a finger bicep. So right here on my hand is what we call a finger bicep. So just like my actual arm, when I bring my arm in, what actually happens to my bicep? Hopefully it grows if I've been going to the gym. So the thing is, when I press that trigger, that finger bicep is going to grow, and we want to ensure it doesn't touch the frame. So when I end up building my full firing grip, I'm going to take the center of my fingerprint, put it on the center of the trigger, but you notice here how my finger bicep is off of the frame. Then I'm going to take my finger straighten off the trigger, and then I am going to build my grip. So that is how we are going to use our hold control in the fundamentals of marksmanship. The next fundamental we have is what we call breath control. Breath control does not affect us that much when we talk about pistol shooting, more for rifles and shotguns, but it still is a little bit applicable. So what breath control is, thousands of times a day, I breathe in, I breathe out, I breathe in, I breathe out. And when I breathe out, there comes a point where I just naturally pause before I breathe in again. Ultimately, that is where I want to take my shot when we're talking about the fundamentals of marksmanship. Now, the big thing is if, something doesn't feel right, I don't hold my breath, right, and turn purple and blue. And if something doesn't feel right, hey, I just start breathing again, and then deep, relaxing breath, and go to that natural respiratory pause. The next fundamental we're going to talk about is trigger control. What trigger control is how we are going to effectively press that trigger. Now, I don't know about you guys at home. I talk to myself when I shoot, just to help myself out. So I ask students all the time, what word do you use to talk about what you are doing to a trigger? And I hear a lot of people talk about squeezing a trigger, pulling a trigger, and ultimately the word we want to use is press the trigger. So we have in our hands what's called sympathetic reflex. What sympathetic reflex is what one hand does, the other hand wants to do, or what one finger does, the other fingers want to do. So if I was going to squeeze an item with my hand, I would squeeze it like this. So what ends up happening, same with the word pull, how do I pull something, right? So the thing is, when we start talking about words, our brain knows the definitions of the words. So what I see a lot of is students that tell themselves to squeeze a trigger, and what ends up happening is as they're pressing that trigger with their trigger finger, they end up milking that grip of the gun, right? So when we use the word press, how do I press something? Nice and easy, and it's not a word that creates sympathetic reflex in our hands. So we always want to use the word press. So the way I'm going to actually work on my trigger control will ensure firearms unloaded. So I go ahead and I put my finger on the trigger, and then I just take up the slack in that trigger, and this is what I call prepping the trigger. So when you take that slack out, you're going to hit a point where you meet resistance. That's what I call the brick wall. So when I prep the trigger, I just prep, and then at that brick wall, I slowly press. Nice and easy press. Nice and easy press. The gun's gonna go bang. Notice I'm gonna keep my trigger finger to the rear. It's gonna eject a round, load that new round, and then I'm slowly gonna go to that trigger reset. Now, the reason I pause at this trigger reset instead of taking my finger all the way off the trigger is that what could I do right now at this point? I can ultimately press that trigger again. These are just good habits to get into, because when we get into defensive shooting, the last thing we want to do in a defensive encounter is prep that trigger, press that trigger, take my finger off the trigger, and then go ahead, prep that trigger and press it again. It takes time, more time to shoot that way, and it's less effective. So that is how we are going to use our trigger control. We're going to use that prep, slow press, and then reset. Okay. Next, we have what we call as follow through. Follow through is when we're going to use all the fundamentals of marksmanship before, during, and after the shot. So what this typically looks like is when I get ready to shoot, I get in a good stance. Right from there, I come up to the gun, and I make sure I have a good grip. So I come high into that back strap. Okay, my finger biceps where it needs to be. I hitchhike that thumb up, karate chop, okay? From here, I'm gonna stand ergonomically upright. From here, I'm gonna bring the sights up to my eyes. From there, I'm gonna go ahead and prep that trigger, and then I'm gonna take a deep, relaxing breath. And then slow press of that trigger. The gun's gonna go off, ejecting a round, loading a new round. And the thing is, when we talk about sight alignment and sight picture, for every shot we take, we ultimately want to get 2 sight pictures. So I get my good sight picture, the gun goes off, I get that recoil, and then I'm gonna go ahead, put my sights back on the target where I want them, and then go ahead, reset that trigger. Now, when I am done shooting, my finger's gonna come nice and high on the shelf here, and come back until I'm ready to fire another shot. So I hoped going over the fundamentals of marksmanship kind of helped and added and kind of refreshing what you probably already know. But the big thing to look out for is that grip management, the cadence in which we shoot, and ultimately how we're going to actuate that trigger. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.